Welcome back. We're doing a textbook today, which might sound kind of boring, but I assure you there's a reason for it, so stick around. And this particular textbook, I think it's still the most recent version, but it was published in 2014, and the reason I'm choosing this particular intro psych textbook is partly because one of the co-authors, perhaps the head author, was the late Susan Nolen-Hoeksema, who, if you don't know, she was a Yale professor. And she's actually featured in what I presume is still accessible on YouTube, an intro psych course that Yale put out for free, which is mostly delivered by Paul Bloom, but Susan Nolen-Hoeksema, she's a guest lecturer in one of the lectures that relates to notions or questions of determining abnormality, which is what we're going to focus on. And some of the sentiments she shares in that lecture, she expresses here too. So it's a brief excerpt, not going to take too long. I'll read it from the chapter on psychological disorders, subheading Defining Abnormality, and then we can talk. All right. You've no doubt heard other people being referred to as crazy, mad, sick, weird, dysfunctional, or abnormal. What do we mean by abnormal behavior? By definition, the word means away from the norm. But by what criteria do we distinguish between abnormal and normal behavior? In this age of rapid technological advances, you might think that there would be some objective test, a blood test or brain scan, that could determine whether an individual has a mental disorder. There is no such test currently, however. Instead, we must rely on signs and symptoms and on a subjective criteria for deciding when those symptoms constitute a mental disorder. A number of different types of criteria for defining abnormality have been proposed. So you've probably heard me claim in previous videos that there are no laboratory tests for any of these psych diagnoses. And coming from me, perhaps that sounds hard to believe, so it's always good to have some more well-known, credentialed experts to reinforce your claims, which is why I'm sharing this particular excerpt. But in addition to that, there's another fascinating little thing on the following page, which I thought I would share too. And there is displayed two images side by side of two women from two different eras wearing two different outfits. And underneath is a caption. What does the caption say? It says, fashions change over time, just as definitions of abnormality do. Quite the admission. Fashion. Does that sound like a science to you? Let me show you. I'm not making this up. There are the images, and you see the caption underneath. Again, quite the admission. And although it's perhaps surprising to see that in what is ostensibly a scientific textbook, they're not wrong. If you look back on earlier iterations of the DSM, which is the book that they use to make their diagnoses, all the criteria are listed in it. We're on DSM-5 right now, but if you look at previous iterations, for example, let's take the DSM-2. If you met criteria for homosexuality, you would consider mentally ill. Now, if you try and find that diagnosis in the DSM-5, you're not going to find it. Why? Did the science change? Did we make some newfound medical discovery? Or was it just culture and politics that changed? So when you look at these different revisions of the DSM, given what the excerpt I just shared acknowledges, that there are no laboratory tests. There were none in 2014, there were none now, there were none before 2014 either. And there were still a ton of diagnoses back then. If there are no laboratory tests, then these revisions, they don't represent advances in our understanding in a medical sense, because we don't have the tools to do the medicine. So what is being revised? And as I mentioned, things that were formerly in it were taken out. So when you look at these different revisions, what you're really seeing, what they really represent is not so much advances in science, but shifts in culture and politics and attitudes toward what is acceptable behavior and what's unacceptable or abnormal behavior. And that the date on which they're published represents, they're kind of a cultural artifact. They reflect attitudes of the time. And it's not so surprising that attitudes about homosexuality, the example I gave before, have shifted quite a bit in the last generation or two. So is it really a surprise that this is reflected in our notions, these put forward notions of abnormality? So who is actually making these decisions, though? Well, when they embark on creating a new DSM, they get together a group of experts, basically. They assemble a team, they have this task force, a task force chair who leads the team. And if you look at someone like Paula Kaplan, the late Paula Kaplan, who I'm sure I'll do a video on, she wrote a book on her experience with the DSM because she was part of one of these teams. And she was so appalled and disgusted with the process that I think she just walked out and quit and then wrote a book about it. But in short, it's a group of experts that basically just spend some time deliberating on what constitutes abnormality and where to make these cutoffs, where these lines should be when it comes to things like depression. How long should you be depressed until you're considered majorly depressed? Or how many situations in which you can't focus, or how frequently can you not focus, and when and where, how often, whatever often means. Do a video about that as well. And then they basically try and come to a consensus. They vote. James Davies published a paper about this, the creation of DSM-3, how he's voting. Now, does that sound like science? People sit around voting on gravity? Speed of light? I don't think so. Now, of course, perhaps you can make the argument that, physics, we have so much more control over the variables. Human beings are much more complicated. It's harder to do. But even within traditional medicine, there's a far more objectivity than you'll find here in psychiatry. But that doesn't stop psychiatrists from making these comparisons to traditional medicine. I've mentioned this before. They'll say they made these arguments for years. You can find people like Robert Sapolsky making and Jordan Peterson making these comparisons of depression or schizophrenia being akin to something like cancer or diabetes, which is a just gross misrepresentation. Because as we've already established and I've mentioned before, these legitimate medical illnesses like cancer or neurological issues like Parkinson's, epilepsy, you can do objective analyses, you can determine, you can identify lesions within the brain that explain the symptoms that the person experiences. You can't do any of this with psychiatry and their diagnoses. So these are completely different universes. All right. So we can perhaps leave it there. One other thing I would just mention, caveat, is that when I make all these criticisms, critiques, point out these flaws in this approach to understanding human problems, some people can come away with this misunderstanding or misinterpretation that, well, if you're saying that the diagnosis is illegitimate or invalid, then are you saying that none of it's real? People are just making it up? And that's a misunderstanding. The experiences are real. People struggle to focus. They feel miserable. They have they experience a low mood or the paranoia, all these things. They're all legitimate experiences within the human condition. The contention is with how they're framed and defined and what is deemed to be the cause. That's the conundrum. So the experiences themselves, that's all legitimate. Well, some people can obviously invent things. There's a phenomenon of malingering, which is legitimate. But for the people that do have or do experience those things, honestly, that's legitimate. Again, the question is, how do we define it, frame it, and understand what causes it? Okay, thanks. Talk to you next time.